Hi, everyone. This is Tom Thurston. I'm with the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. We're at the Macmillan Center at Yale University. And this is one of our first GLC teacher workshops that we've started. And I'm really pleased to present today Maisa Tisdale. Maisa is kind of an old friend now. We haven't seen each other, though, for almost exactly a year.
That's
We
right.
met each other in February in Bridgeport, where Maisa gave kind of a version of this talk, talking about the work that she does at the Mary and Eliza Freeman Houses. And after the presentation, her and Dan Broiled, who's a professor of African American Studies at Central Connecticut State University, went with Maisa and got the kind of grand tour and the kind of the vision of it. And we were just overwhelmed and stayed. I think we must have took another hour and a half of your time or so, and really enjoyed ourselves. And I just hope I gave you a hug goodbye, because it's been a year since then. And but it's great to have you, and it's great to have everyone on board and watching. Let me introduce Maisa. Maisa Tisdale was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her parents were educators and civil rights activists there in the city. And she has 6 generations of her family were born or have lived in Bridgeport. So she goes way back. She has been advocating for the preservation of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Houses since 1994, and founded the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community in 2009 after coordinating a successful movement to save the houses from demolition. She led the Freeman Center as a volunteer until 2019, when she became the center's first professional staff member. And over the past 10 years, she's not only focused on the restoration of the Freeman houses, but has worked to create a safer and a healthier built environment in Bridgeport's South End, stressing the importance of historic preservation, community development, environmental justice, and climate change. And it really is, and from talking to you, I think that's one of the wonderful things about this project, Maisa, is that you really are consciously looking at all these things and thinking about, the importance of historic preservation as also being a story of community preservation. And so maybe we could begin, if you could, by saying a little more about the genesis of the project and how you came to discover the Freeman houses, and just a little about the state you found in them.
Sure. We came to the project out of an effort to save the houses from demolition. They were owned by a community nonprofit, a community action agency, Action for Bridgeport Community Development. And the houses had actually been donated to ABCD the way you donate a car, or something like that. They donated these 2 houses. I believe that there was a widow whose husband had owned these houses. They were used for residents, but they had been divided into multiple residencies, and they weren't in the best of conditions. So the woman donates them to ABCD, and there was absolutely no knowledge at all that these were historic homes. So enter Charles Brilvich, and this actually happened before he became the city historian. He was part of an office that was looking for cultural assets, anything that might be used to further the development of Bridgeport and encourage people to invest in the city. And he was doing his sweep, his inventory of the south end of Bridgeport. And at the end of one day, he noticed that there was a Cuban cleaners and tailors. And so he decided the next day to bring his pants back to get hemmed, of all things. And as he was entering the building, he actually noticed that the tailor shop was cobbled onto a very, very old house. And the house bore no resemblance to any of the architecture in the area. And he thought, gee, how did this house end up here? What is this place? And lo and behold, he noticed another house of matching dimensions from from the same time period. And now he was really curious, why were there these two houses? Now, what Charles didn't realize at the time is that he was reviving, he was um, unearthing a, a history that was part of Bridgeport's past that had been forgotten. It had completely vanished from modern memory. And as he looked and he carefully researched these two houses, lo and behold, he finds out that they're part of a larger community. So um, Charles Brilvich ended up working with ABCD to get the houses listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And everyone thought that that was the happy ending to the story. And instead, it was just the beginning of a longer battle. But the community pulled together. The preservation community came and gave us a hand, the National Trust, the Connecticut Trust, scholars from surrounding universities, the archaeologists, people just came together, local activists, residents, and fought for these houses not to be demolished. And I was aware of the history before this, but I really got involved at that time. I saw that someone needed to step forward and make sure that this battle never stopped until the houses were saved. And fortunately, there were so many people who felt a love and an affinity for these houses and for the story of Little Liberia that they stayed the course. And together, the community saved these houses and really held them in place, served as stewards until the organization was ready for its next phase. So there had to be an organization that saw these, not just the restoration of the homes, but built the capacity to support these homes in a greater vision over time. And that's what the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community is. It's an outgrowth of the movement to save the houses from demolition. There are people on the board who reflected the different elements of the coalition that came together to save the houses. And so then the next 10 years, this was 2009, became dedicated to fundraising, to teaching about the history, and still really there were different times when the houses were endangered again of being demolished, and we had to fight those battles. But it was an important 10 years because it gave us the opportunity to make ourselves known to fundraisers. So we currently have almost $2 million that will go toward the restoration of the houses. That comes from a variety of sources, but the lion's share comes from the state. There's a program called Good to Great. Also, the State Historic Preservation Office reached out to other state agencies, the Department of Housing, and also out to the city of Bridgeport. And we have funding to go forward with the restoration, although not quite to see it all the way through. And then but we needed money for design, for architects, for engineers. The National Trust for Historic Preservation stepped in there. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, the Preservation Connecticut, which was the Connecticut Trust, also gave us funds in order to achieve the design and the plans that we needed. And the good folks of Bridgeport, just ordinary people and people statewide, stepped up with another $50,000, no, almost $100,000. And then we had other outside people who were interested in the project who came up with about another 250,000. And all of that just came together in November. The earlier pieces with the state came together in 2019. So we're just grateful. And now for the first time, we can sit back and think about our mission in the larger vision of this project.
Right, and in addition, you're on like the house is on the, what is it, the National Register of the 10 most endangered historic properties in the country. Is that correct?
Okay, so what it was in 2018, the National Trust for Historic Preservation put us on a list of the 11 most endangered historic properties in the nation. And this is actually a privilege.
Yeah.
This is quite an achievement. There's a very rigorous application process that places have to engage in. And then from thousands of applications, the National Trust chooses 11 projects that aren't only endangered. You have to be endangered, but you also have to tell a historical story that is of such importance to the national historical narrative that but for your place, but for your historic site, that story might be lost, and the history of the United States would be compromised if it were missing. And so that was quite a privilege. That was in 2018, and that allowed us to sort of send up a flare that was seen nationwide and even internationally.
So, so let's hear a little more about what it is about those houses and that neighborhood and the history that made this national group pick this house in Bridgeport.
Well,
Tell us about the Freeman sisters and their and their community.
Well, I actually have a video, but I will tell you a little bit first. The Freeman sisters were basically real estate developers, and they developed real estate in the area that was Little Liberia. They built houses in 1848, which was the same year that Connecticut was finally through with slavery. And at first, for a little while, they rented the houses, then they moved in themselves, and they played a role in a mortgaging system and a land development system in Little Liberia. And so they were extremely successful and hardworking at a time when women in the US couldn't even vote. And during that time, Mary Freeman, when she passed away, the only person in Bridgeport who was wealthier than she was P.T. Barnum. And so it sort of tells a story. Anyway, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you the video at this time. This is a video by Pedro Bermudez that was part of our fundraiser. Some of you might have seen it, but I think it explains a lot. Now, I am going to try to share my screen as I was taught to do. So,
Okay,
okay, hang on for 1 second. All right, hold on a second. I'm about to share. Okay, I've got this now.
I'm gonna sing till the spirit moves in my heart. I'm gonna sing till the spirit moves.
I'm Maisa Tisdale, and I'm the president of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community. And right now, we're standing in the heart of historic Little Liberia. Is it okay? This is Walter's AME Zion Church. the oldest surviving African-American church in Fairfield County. And right across the way are the Mary and Eliza Freeman Houses. This church was built by three men. One of them was the founder of Little Liberia, Joel Freeman, Mary and Eliza's brother. And they found that there really wasn't a role, there really wasn't a place for them, status for them as free men. And that's why people really started this community, to be safe, to offer sanctuary, and to prosper using their God-given gifts and talents. Little Liberia turns 200 years old in 2021. The Mary and Eliza Freeman houses are just a block away from here. They would have stood big and bold, and they would have been really prominent on the block. One of the challenges that we faced from getting people to understand and embrace the story was the fact that there were no photographs, that all of the other buildings had been torn down.
To see it from that perspective makes me feel the presence of the ghosts of the other buildings that have been lost, and like recognize the sturdiness of these that are still remaining.
I can just picture Mary and Eliza Freeman coming out in the morning on their porches, looking across at this community that was around them, that was both beautiful with gardens. I bet they could hear the choir singing from the church as they walked this way. This was a planned community, an early planned community where people of different socioeconomic levels, different levels of education lived together. It was a sanctuary city, and it was very much an inclusive place. It was a place where people visited from all over the US, and they wanted to take advantage of this new invention called the railroad. For those of us who studied Little Liberia and the Freeman houses, this community was alive. We could see it in our minds, we could hear it, we could smell the flowers, we could hear the bustle, but how did we share that with everyone else?
Thank you for making the learning experience easier and more enjoyable. Oh my God. I can't read it. This is so nice. Dear Ms. Shannon, thank you so much for your tour and teaching of Little Liberia, all about the past and how it impacts us now. Thank you so much for your time and support. Lots of love. And this is when we were standing outside the house. That's when they got to ask questions about the history, and they first walked up. For the first few minutes, they just stand there staring and like taking it all in and getting an understanding of, you know, the shape and the levels. And so they really just absorb it, and it's almost like they saw something they've only imagined for the first time.
Little Liberia wasn't the only settlement of free people of color that was an underground railroad destination community that offered sanctuary, but it's the only one that's left. It's the only one that still has original buildings on their original foundations. It's endangered. It's the last of its kind. So we don't have a chance to go back in time and save those Liberias. They've been plowed under, knocked down long ago by urban renewal. But we can save this one.
And then maybe the longer term project is the development of this site into housing and the Center for History and Community, you know, the sort of like more built out version of this. So that's one of the two kind of design drawings that we're going to have. But I also want to show you sort of the rest of the sort of structure for the document, again, all in draft form. So like, for example, this image here, I love, and there's a whole, you can find many of these images where like the ghosts of historical structures are actually felt in the landscape. Are you okay? I didn't realize you were crying. good or bad? It's good. Okay, it's good. Well, we've only just begun, Maisa. Wait till you see the end result.
We are planning a community in the South End for the future that is inclusive, that is inviting, and that helps people live up to the aspirations of this nation the way it was supposed to be.
Thanks so much. That was really moving.
You're welcome. Hold on. I'm still finding my way. Oh gosh.
Well, we can see you.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
I can now see you.
So that's, I mean, it's such a challenging project that you have ahead of you. So how was it that, you know, this community and these families who were virtually unknown when the Rovich came across the houses and started investigating, you know, what kind of resources, how did you go about kind of making the Little Liberia community come alive? And what do we know about that community? Like when it was established, who was it who was living there? What kind of their occupations and you know, what was it like to walk the streets there?
All right, well, Little Liberia is in the south end of Bridgeport, almost in the water. And a lot of the south end is actually landfill. So the south end of Bridgeport, when Little Liberia was established, was awash with water. So most of the land where the utilities are, for people who know the geography, although part of Little Liberia was behind its fence, the rest is landfill. Seaside Park, you know, a lot of that was landfill. There was water coming across where Gregory is going toward Whiting. And there was also an impenetrable swamp, what was described as an impenetrable swamp to the north of Little Liberia. So this was an area that we think that whites didn't settle because it was unwanted. In those days, people didn't want to live close to the water. They felt that it carried disease. We figure that's why that land was pretty much vacant. So there was a real estate transaction in 1821. So this is actually the 200th anniversary of Little Liberia. The houses are about 170 years old. So there was a real estate transaction that took place, and two men bought equal shares in a structure, and they started building from there. We believe that it was Joel Freeman, who was of Pugusset and African-American descent. His sisters, Eliza and Mary as well. And so they built this community and opened its doors to both Native people and people of African descent as a place where people could live in safety and with dignity, and where they could use their talents to survive, and to more than survive, to thrive. And this was also what could be looked at as a poster child for an African-American seafaring community. Joel Freeman and many of the men actually worked as seamen. And I noticed years ago when Charles was showing me the census that all of these men were seamen. And so there seemed to be a disproportionate number of men who had experience working the sea. As it turns out, that was the network that they went to when they wanted to establish this place. So the people used to come together where the Bridgeport Public Library is now on Sundays and worship under a tree. And we believe that Joel Freeman came one Sunday and said, look, we need a place where we can prosper, paraphrasing, because although there were Native and Black people living in freedom in Connecticut, being a freed person of color was not the same as being a free white person. They weren't the same. Being a free person of color just meant you were not enslaved, you were not owned. So their existence was tantamount, it was more like living in South Africa during apartheid. They had to have passes, they couldn't work certain places, they couldn't do certain jobs. And Black people and Native people who lived scattered throughout Connecticut tended to be very poor and just living a subsistence kind of existence. By establishing this place, Little Liberia, well, they called it Liberia at the time, which means free land, people could come together and live in safety and prosper. What we see that's so amazing is that when Joel Freeman and the other seamen came, they would go to sea and make money. It was the only place where men of color could make the same amount of money as white men. They would bring the money back. And so what that did is that changed the role of women in this community, because the men would go back to sea, the women would use that money to run the businesses, to develop real estate, to settle other people who needed sanctuary, whether they were Native Americans or African American people. And they just grew this community that was quite diverse ethnically, although there weren't white people. Well, there was one white man, we believe a German Jewish man, who was married to a woman of color. But everyone else was from somewhere else. They were from the Caribbean, they were from Haiti, from Jamaica, from Cape Verde. They were from different tribes in the area. And they were determined that there would be a place where Indigenous and African people could live in dignity, where they could live outside of the stereotypes and the degrading sort of images that whites had of people of color at this time. And what was really interesting, people were of different religions. The Native people who lived in this area, the Pagusets, they carried on their traditions among their African American relatives and vice versa. And so they accomplished something that we have yet to accomplish to this day, where you had people of different backgrounds, different classes, different circumstances, living together in dignity as equals. So
Right, yeah.
yeah, it makes it important. And it was an Underground Railroad destination community, which meant that people didn't have to necessarily hide out of sight, because since the whole community from the outside looked Black, what was another person of color? So people were able to, get themselves on their feet and either stay there or move on. And I guess the other thing that's notable is the resourcefulness of financing this community. The men of this community reached out to their sailing brethren, and they asked them to settle, to visit, or to invest in this community. And so it was an infusion of money from people of color that built this community. So there were a lot of firsts there. There was a luxury hotel for wealthy Blacks from New York City. Some people came from Weeksville. Many people know Weeksville and lived in the community. It was also a place, they had a school for colored children that they petitioned for, Bridgeport's first free lending library. And so this community was prosperous, and they were bent on really improving life, not just for Black people in the area, but nationwide. So we find that one of the first colored conventions is held in Bridgeport. Now, some of the colored conventions, there are websites that, and even our own, where you can read about how free Black people were they were outspoken, and they were at the lead of the movement to free Blacks from slavery, and later on to get the right to vote, and later on to lift the standards of life and to demand social justice. So Little Liberia was at the heart of this. And so a lot of the issues that we face today, they reflected on in their time. And we can learn a lot from the speeches, from the articles, from the pamphlets. And we also know that they planned to settle what they were calling refugees from the South around the time of the Civil War. So there, Bridgeport might have developed into a very Black city, had they been able to go through with plans to bring people from the South who were displaced by slavery in the Civil War, to bring them into Little Liberia and settle.
Everything you're saying, makes me reflect on how simply by studying Little Liberia and this story, it challenges you to kind of have a completely different historical understanding of African Americans in the United States, but also of the thinking of a Black diaspora that's happening, that diaspora community that is cosmopolitan, that's interconnected, so that you have people there because of the nature of their profession. They're sailors, and they're work on ships, and that so they know these aren't people who are living kind of like tight little narrow lives in their little community. Like I think we often think of people in poverty, that they or that the people of color then were simply impoverished in that, but instead they have the whole world at their touch. And the other thing I think that's really revealing of this is like thinking about these organizations like the colored conventions, and the kind of issues that they weren't just fighting against slavery. They're, like you say, this is a civil rights movement that was happening in the North before the Civil War, and they were asking for education, voting rights, access to public transportation, all the kind of issues that we see arising up in the 30s and 40s and 50s with in the 20th century. What we think of the civil rights movement, it's like there were people back then that were struggling for the same kind of issues. And I think especially to teachers out there, that if you start to think about the history of Black America, I think it's more like Little Liberia than necessarily the kind of picture I think that most people have, is these vibrant kind of communities that are really pushing things forward.
And they were fighting for economic empowerment and education. They were really savvy. They really were effective as well. And so by studying the story of Little Liberia, it makes us aware of other issues that have become the systemic racism of our time. So what we see, people often ask me, well, what happened to Little Liberia? I can't tell you exactly what happened to Little Liberia, but I can tell you some of the forces that had an impact on it. So one of the things that we see is we see Connecticut, right? Everyone thinks of Connecticut as this progressive New England state that, this is where the Underground Railroad came from the open hearts of good white people who reached in and saved Black people who were victims. And instead, when you study the Little Liberia story, you find just the opposite. You find empowered and engaged Black people who found white allies in a state that was really racist. So you see Connecticut being referred to as the Mississippi of the North, all right? So we're the last state to get rid of slavery, the last state to allow Blacks to vote. This was not an easy state, and you see Connecticut begin to pass race-based laws that enforce segregation in living places and where you could work, and education right up into the 1900s. So in the hold on, let me just take a quick peek here. In 1935, you see the state of Connecticut uphold a school segregation statute, which it originally passed in 1869, all right? 1935. You see in 1933, Connecticut declares miscegenation a felony. So you're talking about the early 1900s. And during this time that little Liberia was founded and thrived and then declined, you see a series of race-based legislation passed within the state that made it very hard for Blacks in Connecticut, Blacks in Bridgeport to thrive. And you see people you see people, I won't say forced, you see people losing their real estate.
Right.
You see people coming into the area and buying land really cheaply. You see, and we know that there were pressures on Blacks in other parts of Connecticut and New England that forced them off of land and out of communities that were thriving. And so what I tell people in talks is that Blacks in Bridgeport were always poor. Blacks in Bridgeport were made poor. And this is actually something that's important to communicate to children, because they have internalized a feeling of inferiority and shame based on the geographic area in which they live. What teaching Little Liberia does, it allows us to tell the social history of a geographical area, which reshapes the way individuals actually see themselves and the way the tiniest of us see ourselves. So I think that what teachers can do with a story like this, first of all, I find that children find it fascinating. Students of all ages, adults find it fascinating because it's a history that they didn't know. They can look at the innovation of Little Liberia with a feeling of pride, and the things that didn't go well, become cautionary tales. But because you tell a whole history and you embed that history in the story of a nation, it returns the sense of being important and being able to hold your head up in pride. It also gives a feeling of agency. So if people in the past have managed to have an impact on their lives, well, we can do the same. I know that you wanted me to show the other video.
Right, but first, I mean, maybe as a way of introducing that, maybe if you could say a little about, as you were saying, that the lessons of Little Liberia are ones that are really valuable today too. And, I'm just curious, first of all, is that, I know your organization isn't just about these houses. You have a whole, crew of programming and that. Could you say a little about what you have to offer to teachers and young people and just the general community?
Right. Well, before the pandemic. Well, like so many other organizations, we're struggling to find our footing after the pandemic. Not so much financially, thank goodness, because of the grants that we received before this, and also because people gave. But just before the pandemic, we had opened up a storefront museum, right? A pop-up museum that would have different exhibits and would be there for teachers and for families. And because of the pandemic, we've had to close it. We just had to. So what we're hoping to do, we will do Zoom lectures. We also hope to do outdoor programming in the spring, walking tours. We've worked in partnership with Housatonic Community College, and we actually have an exhibit in place there called, Reimagining Little Liberia, Restoration and Reunion. And Housatonic Community College has been a wonderful partner for us. And it's actually the art gallery, the art museum that's gone out of their way to make sure that we had a place to actually conduct programming.
Right.
Our exhibit is up in Housatonic, and they actually have a program that works with teachers and that takes students through the exhibit. They will be making the exhibit available online.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they train, their program is really precious. It trains the students to be docents.
Oh, nice.
They can, in fact, be the ones who tell the story of Little Liberia, who give guided tours of Little Liberia. And we really hope that we can do that with them in the spring and even in the summer when school is out. So I think that one of the advantages of working with community-based historic sites or heritage sites is that we function within the community even when school is out of session. And we are able to create this sort of hands-on experience and excitement that can begin with teachers who are teaching in the classroom and then continue even when school is out, and also provide opportunities for teachers. And so teachers can help us teach the invisible. I'm frequently fascinated by the fact that these are two old houses. And even when we were working on preservation deconstruction in 2012, and the place was a construction site, it became a mecca for people who were really interested in knowing their history. People would come, they bring their children, they bring their classrooms. Yale sent some folks down from graduate school. We had buses of people who were on family reunions, and we counted them, and we had, over 1,000 people who came to see a construction site. So we actually worked with the construction team and trained them to be hard hat docents, and they also recovered the archaeological artifacts found there, and they actually filled out all the paperwork on them, what they were, what period they're from. They researched them online, and they could tell you anything. Yeah.
Well, they're usually, oh man, that is a real score. Usually they're the ones who say, we're not stopping everything.
They were great. They were great.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, they were actually in a program that was set up to give them preservation construction skills, because contractors who work in preservation can make, like at that time, 40% more than the person who does the same job in somebody's house or in a building. So it was part of a program where we had interns who were learning these trades, and we taught them the history, and we taught them about archaeology during this period as part of their training. It was actually teaching environmental skills, and how to remove asbestos and things like that. So they learned this, and they became so enthusiastic about the project. So their trailer became a classroom, and it became a workshop for archaeology. But what we can do is we can do these kinds of classroom experiences with teachers via Zoom when the weather gets good and we can socially distance on the ground. We can do that. We can do tours. And the nice thing about the program at Housatonic is available. I don't know how many classes they can accommodate. You'll have to ask them that, or email me later and we can figure that out. But they teach the kids, I think they're middle school students, to be docents. And that means that in the spring and the summer, even when school is out, they can still be engaged in history activities that talk about history. And I just wanted to say something also. Older students can help us with research that needs to be done, or classrooms can. There's a lot of information that is actually tied to Little Liberia, but people don't realize it.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that information on the community doesn't exist, it's just that it's fragmented and people
Right.
don't tie it to a community. And one example of this is Hugh Price, a wonderful man. And he wrote a book, which I thought I had. Okay, hold on, going on screen. Here's Hugh's book. I don't know if you can see it, everybody.
Yeah.
All right. So Hugh Price is a wonderful man. He was the head of the National Urban League, but he comes from a family that of 3 lineages that go back to Little Liberia. And what we didn't realize is just what a significant crossroads this is. So if any of you have relatives in the Connecticut area who were here anywhere between 1800s and 1890s, 1900, before or after, you probably have folks who came through Little Liberia and you didn't know it. And also for scholars, there are often Little Liberia connections that scholars don't recognize. One of the things I learned from reading Hugh Price's book, everyone talks about the story of George and Rebecca Latimer. They're the first fugitives. George was the first fugitive slave whose emancipation guided and influenced US abolitionists. And Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, came to his aid. It was a cause célèbre at the time. It was a big deal. Well, it turns out that George was Hugh Price's, I hope I've got this right, pardon me, Hugh, if I don't, second great-grandfather, right? And that family eventually ends up in Little Liberia. But he didn't realize that this was part of a settlement. He just knew that they lived in Connecticut. But it turns out that his family actually helped found this community because of Nero Hawley, right? So in Trumbull, Connecticut, Nero Hawley's gravesite and housed there on the Freedom Trail, the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Let's plug the Connecticut Freedom Trail. That's a resource that's great for teachers. Thank you, all right?
Really, yeah.
Okay, so Nero Hawley's on there. Now listen to how things are interconnected. Nero Hawley was given his freedom because when it came time to fight in the American Revolution, right, you had to send somebody. Well, not all the white families wanted to send someone. They didn't want to go. Right. So the Hawleys sent their enslaved man Nero in exchange for his freedom. So Nero ends up serving with George Washington at Valley Forge, right? He comes back, he gets his freedom, and it's his grandsons who are 3 of the people who founded the AME Zion Church, right?
Right. That you were that you were sitting in.
And they become these free people who become part of this crusade. This family is also Native American. So it also gives us a chance to talk about the difference between ethnicity and culture, and it gives us a chance to talk about, tribal histories that are left out of the story or forgotten. It gives us an opportunity to bring members of tribes in to actually tell their own story. And
Yeah.
teachers should take advantage of that. Instead of teaching, say, Pawgasset history as something that happened in this, they teach indigenous histories early on, like in the 1700s, and then they don't teach them anymore.
Exactly.
But the truth of the matter is that these are people whose families have contributed and who still live here now. Bring these people into your classroom.
Absolutely. I mean,
Talk about the issues that affect them.
yeah, that's such a valuable advice. I agree entirely. It's maddening the way Indigenous history and Black history, for that matter, is taught as if it's unimportant. It's only important, from until the end of the Civil War or something like
Right.
that, and then it's like it disappears from the school curriculum, and the same goes for the Pawgassets and others. Is it you really, if you want to tell a complete story of the United States, you have to kind of know these histories, and it tells us a much more richer story to tell, and it engages students so much. And I do want to ask you, in addition to that, you mentioned, I mean, it's like the Center for History and Community, and of the kind of things in the bio I read, is that you're also talking not just about historic preservation, but community development and environmental justice.
Oh my
and-
gosh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
There's
what
a
happened?
huge coyote going across my yard. It looks like a wolf, it's so big.
Oh my God. Uh, make sure your windows are all shut.
Yeah, we have feral cats. I don't know how they're gonna. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There's just a
That's
little
all right.
right across in front.
This is the wonder of a Zoom meeting, is there's no telling what's going to happen. But no, I was curious, this is a story about climate change now. I mean, right? So enlighten us. How is that fitting into the preservation
Right.
effort, and also kind of just the way the community is, the kind of struggle the community is going through right now?
Right. So, interestingly enough, in our mission originally, we had something that talked about the built environment and climate. But I always thought it was something that we would get to much later on, that it would sort of be peripheral to the work that we do now. But what happened was Superstorm Sandy.
Yeah.
Superstorm Sandy hit with a vengeance, and our area in Bridgeport was the most impacted by the storm surge of any other in the state. The Mary and Eliza Freeman Center has grown organically.
Mhm.
We see ourselves as a neighbor in a larger community, right? We have the same problems as the rest of our neighbors, but we might be able to give our neighbors more of a voice as an organization than they might have individually. And so when after Superstorm Sandy, there was no the cell phone service, no cable, no internet, no TV. There was radio, but radio came out of, like, our radio markets now are different. So a lot of it wasn't local. I could hear what was going on in the rest of the country, but I couldn't hear what was going on right down in Bridgeport. And so I got in my car and I headed to the south end. I got there like dawn was breaking. I got there before the National Guard got there. And basically they cut off the entries to the neighborhood. And it was like, I guess it's more imaginable now with COVID, but it was like a different country. The force of the water, the pressure of the water had forced people's doors open on their houses, and water, the water was receding, but there was a good 4 feet of water in storefronts and in people's houses. People were walking around in their nightgowns, barefooted, just disoriented because not everyone had evacuated. I looked in the barber shop next to us and everything was floating around. And it's so funny because the barber came in and she said, Maisa, she said, everything is in the wrong place. I don't know what happened. I said, I'll tell you what happened. Everything was floating everywhere. And when the water receded, it just, fell. There were cars that were on top of fences, a block away. The sign for the Spanish restaurant was behind the Walters Church. It was just, the worst. Now, the houses actually fared pretty well because they weren't closed, because of the state they were in, and the water went through. We were working on the site at the time. The porta potty got smashed up against the wall and we had to go retrieve it. But we're in a neighborhood, and we had to deal with the flooding just like everybody else. And so around the same time, there was a conference in Newport, Rhode Island about keeping history above water. We participated in that. Rebuild by Design was underway, and Resilient Bridgeport, which was sort of the enlargement of that. And it's almost been 10 years that we've been involved with climate resilience and dealing with the impact of sea level rise. And also we knew that it was, really important for us to get involved because in our community, we did a count of residences and figured out that it was almost 600 families and individuals who were living in houses on the National Register of Historic Places. Ordinary Bridgeport residents living in houses that told a story, not just of Little Liberia, but of the contributions of immigrants and working class people to the industrial might of this nation that also won wars and positioned it as a global leader. And it told the story of this period of time of industrialization that was in Bridgeport. It was consciously planned because so much of the founding fathers of the city of Bridgeport, their wealth was indirectly derived from slavery. So P.T. Barnum and other people realized that the city of Bridgeport had to build its economy on something else. And so they built it on eventually on industry and on war. So Bridgeport played a disproportionate part in arming the troops, not just for World War I, but then later for World War II. So it took the industrial might of factories and put them to work for the world. Now, what's so fascinating is the same roughly 12 blocks that tells the story of the Pagussets and other tribes, that tells the story of African-American people and Caribbean people who came to the US in early days, and the fight for freedom and social justice and the roots of the civil rights movement and the Pan-Africanist movement. That same 12 blocks tells the story of women coming into the workforce, tells the story of immigrants and working class whites contributing, to the building of this nation. Within the same 12 block area, we can tell the story of the people of America.
And this needs to be about, community preservation as much as anything.
Right.
The South End is like modest, working class neighborhood, but it is like just steps away from some of the most kind of, sought after shoreline property, along the Gold Coast of Connecticut. If you go, if you go through the South, keep going, you've showed me the area. It's just like, I know that there's pressures to kind of buy up a lot of that property and like redevelop it and send all those people out.
Right. So we also end up telling the story of redlining. We end up telling the story of the origins of urban renewal in eugenics.
Boy.
We end up telling the story of how human beings interact with natural resources. We have power plants that had to be on the water. So we tell the story of gentrification. We tell also the story of environmental justice, just by telling the story of 12 blocks.
Yeah.
So if you want to make this world a better place, you can just learn and tell the story of the South End. You can celebrate the achievements of people, and we can tell those cautionary tales. And more than that, we can tell people what it means to participate in the democracy that this US was, aspired to be. So if you can vote, that's one thing that you can do to make this nation what you want it to be. So, we didn't tell people in our voting video, vote this way or that way.
Yeah.
But what we did tell people is that this struggle is a long historical struggle, but it's also a struggle that people can impact. So what we're hoping is that Native American people, African American people, the immigrants who came to this area, the people who make up what they call the white working class, right? That they learn the history of this 12 blocks. In so doing, everyone will become more proud of their origins and heritage, and everyone will also see that it's possible to put distance between maybe the things that weren't good and weren't right.
Right.
And we can resolve to work together as one. And I'm hoping that this is what people will take out of the Little Liberia experience. I mean, those people, they created what they did against enormous odds. 90% of African Americans enslaved at the time when they established this. Nero Hawley's time, the grandparent of the Hawley brothers who founded the community as well. Half of the clergy in Connecticut enslaved Black people when Nero Hawley fought with George Washington, right? So these roots of systemic racism go deep. But what the story that we get to tell with Little Liberia is an uplifting one. We can see everyone's best over the years. We can also see the problems that, the stubborn, ugly problems of this society, but we can also show that we've made progress. So I think that there's everything in the story of these blocks, if we can preserve them, if we can keep access to them, that allows us to learn to shape a better world and give students a chance not only to be docents, but to, in a sense, work in a laboratory of social history and figure out where their footing is and where they want to go and how they want to contribute. And there's something inspiring for everyone in this experience. And yeah, so we hope to get more digital humanities on the website. There are research projects that students can do of all ages, of all different grade levels, that will actually add, they'll actually see that added to, to the body of knowledge about Little Liberia. And right now, we could use teachers telling us how we can help, because, the trajectory that we had prior to the pandemic, it has to shift now.
Right.
So, what can we do, to serve the needs of teachers and their students?
Well, yeah, this is kind of the work that I'm trying to do too. And I think that projects like yours are just a wonderful way for teachers to not only have something for their students, but also have an opportunity to find other teachers that are really, and energized and who look at history as a way of kind of, making sense of the world that we live in today. And I guess, I mean, this whole conversation has been a great segue for showing that video that I've, been raving to you about. I just think it's such a marvelous video. I'm not going to say anything more about it. Maybe if you could show it, and then afterwards we could talk a little about it, because there are some people who need to be acknowledged in the making of this.
All right, let me see if I can do this again, folks.
He's a pro now. I mean, I'll just leave for.
Uh-oh. Hold on.
Okay.
I meant to share my screen. Sharing the screen.
You didn't think you'd be doing this a year ago.
No, I didn't even know what this was a year ago. I would like to say I did, but I didn't.
To the voters of the state of Connecticut, how can the rights of any class of men be safe or secure when they have no voice at the ballot box? When they are stripped of the freeman's helmet, sword, and shield?
Can you try to pull up the video?
Is it shared yet?
Who shall guard
Not yet.
when
Okay,
those in
sorry,
whom
hold
the
on.
spirit of prejudice and injustice?
Pardon me, everyone.
Okay.
I forgot you have to hit it twice. Ah,
That's all right.
all right.
Everyone is staying online.
Okay, here we go. I'm hitting a share button.
Okay.
Tom, if you can tell me when it's on and how it's going, like if you see
Okay.
my screen, please do.
Yeah, I will.
All right.
I see the screen is already coming up. Here it is. It looks like it'd be a little bigger, but let's see. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm going to mute so I don't.
Of the states of Connecticut, how can the rights of any class of men be safe or secure when they have no voice at the ballot box? When they are stripped of the freeman's helmet, sword, and shield? Who shall guard their interests when those in whom the spirit of prejudice and injustice is found make and administer all the laws by which the wronged and oppressed are to be governed? Why chain the lion and then beat him because he does not run? Why clip the wings of the eagle and then scorn him because he does not soar? We have a claim upon this state and a right to be treated as other citizens are treated. We owe a debt to the colored population of this country, which we can never pay. No, never, never. Unless we call back the oceans of tears and all the groans and agonies of the Middle Passage. Amos G. Beeman, George W. Francis, Samuel T. Gray, 1849.
That was, I think that's such an amazing, powerful video. Tell me first a little about the people who put this together.
All right. So you met one of them earlier. That was Shauna Melton, one of our educators. She's an accomplished artist and poet. And she also teaches in schools and she runs workshops. She is our arts ambassador.
Right.
And this was also done by Pedro Bermudez. He's in Hartford, who did the other video for us. This was the first video. Actually, they were supposed to be working on this video when Pedro turned the camera on me crying in the back office. And that scene for the first video that we had. And he's a professional filmmaker. And then Catherine Gray is a local photographer. For some reason, Bridgeport is blessed with just an abundance of wonderful photographers, and Catherine is just amazing the way he captures images of history as they happen. And so those pictures that we used were people from Bridgeport at a Black Lives Matter protest in Bridgeport, and then a group of Bridgeporters went to DC, and actually it was quite a while ago.
Yeah, last summer.
Right. And no, before that it was like 2016 and
Oh, really?
yeah. So it also shows again that the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on for some time. So it was a way for us to take our historical knowledge and, put it with modern day. And people were very surprised at the end to find out that people were saying these, making these same comments and speaking out in the 1800s.
Yeah, that's taken from one of the Connecticut Colored Conventions.
Right, exactly.
The program to one of those in 1849. And, you're absolutely right. Those words, are speaking about the same things. So I just think it's such a powerful example of what history can do to kind of, just make you feel a little more connected in a way with like a long struggle.
Right. And it makes you feel proud that, our ancestors were really looking out for us and that they were involved in changing the world. And so all of us, we should be inspired and carry on. And so that's the difference maybe between the Freeman Center and some other historical preservation groups, is that, we want to be equally present in the past. We want to be aware of the past, the present, and the future. So for us, it's not just a matter of preserving two old houses and saying, even very significant houses like those, we want to take that and make those houses sort of a focal point for our aspirations for the future, and to learn those lessons. When I was a kid, I said, one of my teachers asked me what I thought I'd want to study in college. And I was pretty young, and I said, you know what? I'd like to study applied history. And the teacher laughed and he said, there's no such thing. I beg to differ. I think there's such a thing.
Those are great words. Hey, listen, all the folks that are watching us, if you have any questions for Maisa, if you go to the Q&A corner of the screen down at the bottom, you can type them in, and I can ask them. It looks like someone said they got to head up. Well, I understand. But if you got any, in the meantime, one of the things that I'm curious about is what, when the houses have been restored, how do you imagine them? Are they to be accessible, to imagine them that people can walk in them and they'll be like kind of furniture of the era? Or how do you kind of picture that kind of stage of the project when you get there?
All right, well, the houses will be completely open to the public. Mary's house, which is the larger of the house, it's the double house. That house has the most historic fabric intact. It's pretty much all from 1848. And so it's really important to us to make sure that people have access to both sides of the Mary House. And people have told us from the very beginning that they want house museums. I know there's a lot of debate about that. People say, oh no, house museums. But first of all, you have to realize there aren't many house museums that are dedicated to African American, Indigenous American stories and histories, okay? And then Bridgeport itself, I don't know that we have any house museums that are actually intact on the site where they were or open all the time. So Bridgeport actually doesn't have a glut of house museums. So right now we have enough funds from the state through its grants to totally restore both houses, the exteriors of both houses. So you'll walk down the street and the houses will be stabilized and restored and preserved completely on the exterior. Eventually, sooner rather than later, and we'll continue raising money for this, we want to make sure that the interior of Mary's house is completely done as it was during the era. And people will just walk in and go back in time. Eliza's house, which is the smaller of the two, was a fancier house because it seems like Eliza was just a fancier person. And it doesn't have as much of the historic fabric still in place. That house will be used as the Resilience Center. So part of the funding that's coming from the state is coming from the Department of Housing as part of its resilience program. Resilient Bridgeport. Most people locally know it as, not? Okay, so Resilient Bridgeport, as part of that, there was to be a resilience center. And what we'll use that house for will be, it'll have a space that has, it'll be a flexible space where we can have public meetings, we can have temporary exhibits, workshops. In the case of emergency, people can come to that house like before or and after flooding disasters to get information and find out what they have to do. One of the things that we found out during Superstorm Sandy is, for example, the Red Cross had come and brought a vehicle to one block, but because there was no electricity and cell phones didn't work and no people just one block over or on the other side of the other block didn't realize that the Red Cross was there. And so what we'd like to be in times like that, in the aftermath of storms and before them, is the place where people know that they can come for information and such. And we'll also have workshops there that teach about climate change and climate resilience, that talk about the impact of climate on historic housing, which so many people in the South and actually inhabit, and things like that. I go from there as well.
Okay, I'm getting a few questions. I'm going to just go through them as received. Lynn Williamson asks if this program will be available to refer to. In other words, are we going to archive this, have a copy of for people to see? And yes, at the Gilder Lehrman Center at our website, and we'll announce it in our newsletter. And if any of you want to join the newsletter, go ahead and leave your email address in the Q&A area, and I'll get you subscribed to that. But yeah, we're going to have them. There'll be, we'll post a notice on Facebook, that sort of thing in the newsletter. But yeah, this is a keeper.
And it's an awesome newsletter.
Oh, thank you.
The newsletter is a resource in itself.
Yeah, I just again, another promo for the center. Is it, and it actually goes to this project in particular. Recently, the center got a grant from Connecticut Humanities to develop resources and and professional development workshops to help teachers in teaching Black and Latino history, which, as many of you may know who are here in Connecticut and teaching in Connecticut, has been mandated by the state of Connecticut for like a year-long elective course in the high schools. And, there's a lot of teachers all over the state who, don't know much about Black and Latino history. And so we're trying to develop online workshops that will save and that, but also we have a newsletter for that project that has lots of things, events and like, not entirely exclusive to Connecticut, because Black and Latino history is more than just Connecticut. But, I do want to focus on it because, as you can see from listening to Maisa, is having like something like the Freeman homes like in your community is such a resource to have when you're teaching. And it's not just, as she's saying, for like a narrow kind of segment of history. It just is a way of kind of opening up and talking about the whole movement of history up until the present day, and thinking, as she was saying, about, what are the things we're struggling with now around civil rights and around climate change and around voting and all those. Is it, these are perennial questions. So some people are. So that's fantastic.
A quick word about Connecticut Humanities, because Connecticut Humanities is a great resource too. I'm sure most of you have found their website. And also, I mean, they funded the Freeman Center and allowed us to put together a website that will enable us to delve into digital humanities going forward. So hopefully we'll have more content for you.
Right. I have another question regarding the spaces. It's from one of the Maisa Tisdales. We have a lot of Maisa Tisdales who just out of solidarity.
Because I did not understand the technology, I forwarded my link and I didn't realize that every link would come in as Maisa Tisdale. So it's
so before the program, all these other Maisa Tisdales started popping onto the screen while we were kind of trying to figure everything out. So anyway, but that's not the first time that has happened. Trust me.
Sorry.
But, one of the Maisa Tisdales asked, "Is there going to be garden space?"
Yes. Thank you for asking that question. Yes, there's going to be garden space. So people they have beautiful gardens. Oh, so thank you for prompting me to talk about the Frederick Douglass letter.
Gotta thank Maisa because it wasn't.
So back in the 1800s, like Frederick Douglass actually wrote about this community in his newspaper. One of his correspondents stayed at the hotel, the Duncan House that was next to Eliza Freeman's house. And at that time, this hotel had to be the tallest structure on the whole Bridgeport landscape because there was nothing else like it at the time. So some folks who were associated, actually we found out, with Weeksville in New York, came to Bridgeport, invested here, also lived here and settled here. And Alexander Duncan built this hotel. And so now I lost my train of thought.
So Douglass was there in the gardens.
Right. Well, he wasn't there, but he wrote about it in his newspaper. And in the newspaper article, it goes on to talk about what this community was like. This is on our website too. You can read the letter. And it talks about the gardens and the birds and the chirps of insects. And it sounds like a completely different place, which it was. And the gardens. So we will have gardens around the house. We'll also have kitchen gardens, so that you can see how people grew food for the kitchen. Most of the land around us now, doesn't lend itself to, expanses of agricultural space. But yeah, there will be gardens. And what we hope is to use those gardens and for people to be able to, sit there, reflect there, come through. And even now, the weeds in the backyard have become a place where migratory birds stop through. So it's a great way to also talk about, those things too. But yes, there will be gardens. Oh,
Okay,
and so Charles Brilvich is researching, what kinds of things would have been planted in the gardens back then. So we also hope to be able to plant some of the things that they would have actually had in the old days.
that's going to be, again, another element to this project that is going to bring in a whole other group of people who are really going to be really fascinated. Like, what did like an antebellum kitchen garden look like? And what
Right.
kind of, all those kind of questions that, and it's another way for your students to kind of just come alive when they think about
And
it.
if any students want to do a project on what people grew in gardens back then, that's actually something that's helpful to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you want to get your students started doing some researching on kitchen gardens and that sort of thing, I bet it'd be appreciated. Let me get to another question. Kathleen Mack asks, one thing I'm bringing my students during hybrid teaching is like virtual tours or field trip type experiences. And, is this something you've thought about doing during the pandemic? Like having something like this maybe, but that could be an experience for students to kind of learn more about the house or,
I think in the spring, when we can be outside, that would be a good time to do that. We haven't filmed it. Maybe Housatonic will be doing some of that as their program. With their program, I'm not sure, but with something that we would love to do. The houses themselves cannot be entered right now, but that's a, you know what? That would be a good topic to talk about historic preservation.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we could do something like that.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. That,
Yeah, thank you.
that's a great idea. Oh, and someone else asks, did you say that 600 people in Bridgeport live in houses that are on the National Historic Registry?
This is 600 families and individuals in our area of the South End.
Right. So their homes are historic homes, but they're not like being on the registry is a
They're
good.
on the National Register of Historic Places because they are of historical significance. And a lot of the houses have been subdivided. We also have historic mills that have become residences. So yeah, there are residences that house, a combination of 600 families or individuals in the South End alone. And so one of the reasons why we brought the area to the attention of Resilient Bridgeport and the National Trust and Preservation Connecticut is because you have this concentration of houses. So let's tell the story. Let's not tear them down because they're old. Let's not have people move out because of flooding and they get knocked down and become part of either industry or utilities, or they become gentrified. Let's tell the story in a way that not only enriches our cultural knowledge, but actually helps sustain the people who have lived in these houses for generations.
So the rest of the neighborhood, what period were the homes that kind of surround the Freeman homes? Were they like late 19th century, early 20th century?
Late 19th century. So when P.T. Barnum decided to focus on industrialization and he got land in the South End, it's really fascinating. I'm telling you, this is a fascinating story. And I love working with Kathy Marr at the Barnum Museum as well. Yeah. And we want to do programs together. But basically, what happened was Barnum promised industries that if they located in Bridgeport, not only would they have space and they could build like state-of-the-art factories, but they would also build housing for their workers that was healthy housing, right? That had certain amenities. So now your workers aren't living in squalor in tenements like they were in New York City. And also that they would be educated, right? So they ended up building these houses for working class people that were lovely. Their cottages. The city also has, back in the day, all right, so like back in the 80s, okay, Bridgeport had, the only city that had more Victorians than Bridgeport, Connecticut was San Francisco. All right. A lot of them are torn down now.
Yeah.
But because there was need to house industrial workers during these periods of time, you ended up with this wonderful architecture. In addition to the factories that could be preserved and restored and turned into residences. And some of them have, some schools have as well. And so that's where you end up with that number of people living in property that's on the National Register. And that's just in the south end of Bridgeport.
That's fantastic.
Right.
I have another question. This may be the last, unless people have other things they'd like to know about. She says, I just joined you. I'm fascinated with your discussion and with Maisa's vision. And she says, I'm curious about the term you use, resilience. Do you want to, can you say more about to you what resilience means?
Okay. Well, I feel like our community actually embodies resilience. So there's the resilience that we know of, bouncing back, right? On a personal sort of level where, if something comes against you and it, knocks you on your butt, you get back up and you get going again. And you learn from that. And you continue to thrive, right? Despite calamity even. But there's also climate resilience. And the idea of climate resilience is to build neighborhoods. In our case, the challenge is sea level rise and flooding, right? In certain places, climate resilience might embody snowstorms or fires, right? So we're looking at the impact that climate change has on our communities. Climate resilience speaks to the ability to build a thriving economy and also to protect life and property, despite the impact that human beings have had on nature. So people might think, well, let's just move away from the water. But most of the US population lives on water or on bodies of water. Our civilizations grew on bodies of water. So even if we were to decide to retreat, let's all move to Montana and the Dakotas, right? We wouldn't really be able to do that. We'd still have to deal with the fact that our cultural assets, our parks, our history is written on the shoreline. So what we want to do in the south end of Bridgeport is to build a climate resilient heritage zone or heritage area, so that if in fact people do retreat from the water, we do it in an orderly way that doesn't impact the generational wealth of the families that live there. We want to make sure that people can go back to work and that they can go back to living and loving and building their families, and contributing to society during this time when human beings have to resolve the issues of our impact on the environment and on climate. So climate resilience has to do with thriving as a community. Individual resilience has to do with, coming through times like COVID-19 and pandemic and social distancing without going crazy or eating each other, and then there's the resilience that we have as endangered communities. How do African Americans, how do Native Americans, how do Black and Brown people, keep up their spirit when things go wrong? resilience is important. It's essential to our being in many aspects of life.
Um, everyone who's still on, boy, I just want to thank you all for joining us. And I know we can't all clap except for me, but Maisa, thanks so much.
Thank
You're
you.
a, a community treasure, and I'm just so impressed with the work that you're doing and your vision, what you have in mind, how you're moving forward, your own personal resilience, and and sharing this vision and that's coming into fruition with all of us. So thanks a lot, everyone. Uh, this has been brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center. And again, before you go, if you want to get the newsletters, give me your email address and I'll do that. And Maisa, thanks for a wonderful conversation. And I learned more about your project, and every time I hear you talk about it.
And thank you for having me.
All right then.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming out.